this is familiar to you. This is the death of God.
Ah, right.
So, in a sense, this was dealt with quite a lot in the discussion about the loss of certainty in our lives. But another way of expressing that in relation to Western monotheism is that what sort of gave an underpinning of certainty to our lives, being brought up in this monotheistic traditions, was that there was some ultimate cause, origin, explanation, meaning in the universe created because of God. And famously in the 19th century, as you know, most famously expressed by Nietzsche and others, God was dead. That was a way of saying that basically there is no purpose, there is no meaning, there is no origin, there is no underlying certainty. And I came across this very strongly as I began to lose my religious faith properly at university in my third year. And so I was particularly struck by its expression in the later Victorians after Darwin, people like, particularly I remember George Eliot, um, and some of those who'd been reading the new biblical criticism that was coming up in Germany, which was showing that the whole biblical story was really just a myth. And that combined with Darwinism and new science suggested that old certainties that have been there for thousands of years were no longer present. And how were you going to live in such a world? So for me, it was my big existential crisis. And it's related to modernity, I was just thinking, because if you separate off the spheres, if you put, when there is God, God is at the basis, the infrastructure in the Marxian sense. But even Marx is another challenge to God, of course. You know, God is a delusion. And 19th century sociology, Emil Durkheim and so on, saying God is we make our gods. I mean, this has been a hidden theme in Western philosophy for a long time, of course. It's an undertone, but it becomes almost universal in the second half of the 19th century. And it's very related to this divisions of modernity, because if you now divide religion off from economics, society, and power, it means that these separate spheres are autonomous, so that there is no religious underpinning to the economy. I mean, there's a big debate about whether Adam Smith actually had to have God below his economic system. And Descartes smuggled him back in at the beginning. God was the first mover before cogito ergo sum. But in the 19th century, you divide, and therefore politics is without God. I mean, you have it in Machiavelli, of course, which is amoral, but it's taken to its extreme by these divisions. So God doesn't influence your social behavior and your family. It doesn't have anything to say about politics, doesn't have anything to say about economics. God is in a box. He's you see it well represented in Trinity College Chapel in Cambridge, which was designed, by the great whatever Wren, by Christopher Wren, and he just made a box. It's totally different from King's College Chapel, which is a soaring Gothic cathedral. By the 18th century and Wren, God is just placed in this box. Outside the box, no God. And that is a really hidden injury, because most people, most of the time, don't realize, they sort of half realize when they ask, why is this invasion of Iraq right or wrong? Or why is this international company behaving in this apparently immoral way wrong? There is no criterion for saying it's right or wrong, because God doesn't exist. So agnosticism and atheism basically is part of this loss created by efficiency. And it's obviously related to Weber and the iron cage, but it's just another way of saying all those
Now,
things I've been saying.
that's interesting. And there was, I mean, I remember in the 80s when I was at the LSE, I think a guy called Martin had written a whole lot of things on secularization, and the idea, the thought was that as modernity takes a grip, everything would become secular, and the death of God, if you like, would expand. But isn't it the case that that hasn't happened? That actually there seems to be, if you like, God's kind of reincarnating himself somehow.
Well, absolutely. I mean, Martin was a sociologist at Oxford, I think, and he wrote a book on secularization or
Yeah.
whatever. And it was the prediction of course, it's the famous prediction that didn't actually come true with Max Weber, which was as we grew more rational, then all superstitions like God would disappear. And the same prediction is there in Marx, of course. And it's one of the big surprises of the 20th century that actually, if you judge religion by a number of people who give large sums of money to the church and turn up, then America is one of the most religious places in the world, and yet the most apparently modern. And that actually leads on to another hidden injury, which is lower down the list, which is fundamentalism
Mm.
as a reaction to modernity. And I think I have talked about it elsewhere, but basically, if the fundamentals, that is God, is threatened, you can have two reactions. One is to try and live in an open, relativistic world, or you can go back and make the fundamental even stronger. And the forms of particularly evangelical fundamentalism in America, taken to extremes by things like the rapturists and the end timers and all those sorts of things, reinstores God in a much stricter and more threatening form, because the Calvinist idea of the saved and the damned is carried to its extreme. And so you are right, you will be saved, God exists, and anyone who deviates from your particular form of morality or system is damned forever. So that's what I remember I forgot in my last thing, which was this, which is tied in with Calvinism, with Puritanism, and with this thing I talked about, sin and guilt.
Yeah.
One of Ernest Gellner's, I remember being rather surprised, but Ernest said to me, Alan, one of my favorite books of all time. He loved Darkness at Noon, which was Koestler. But he also, I don't know if you know, but he always also loved James Hogg, Confessions of a Justified Sinner. I don't know if you know that book, but if you don't, you must read it tomorrow.
Right.
James Hogg was an early 19th century poet. He was known as, in his poetry, he was known as the Ettrick Shepherd. He lived in the borderlands of Scotland, the Ettrick region, and he wrote a lot of very good poetry and other books. But so he was a successor to the Scottish Enlightenment. He was in the tradition of Hume and so on, but not a philosopher, but a novelist. And the Memoirs of a Justified Sinner is a wonderful study of the dark consequences of fundamentalism. It's an attack on the Calvinist tradition in Scotland, which was very strong. And it's basically the story of a man who murders someone, and then he is pursued by the devil. And it's the sort of punishment. He's a justified sinner. In other words, he is saved, but he is also a sinner, and he's also damned. And it's a wonderful psychological study of damnation and fundamentalism, which Ernest it obviously attracted Ernest because he felt this same,
Yeah.
being pursued by some demon or other.